All right, we're going to try and finish up the PowerPoint. Juniors, I know you were testing today. We went over a few things. The PowerPoint is up on the Google Classroom, so kind of go back through. Really quickly, I'll kind of tell you what we talked about in class today. We talked about imagery and how powerful that is. We talked about and gave examples of mnemonics, memory aids. Remember, I gave you one when we went over biology, when we were talking about neurotransmitters. I gave you the acronym SNAGD. All right, that is a type of memory aid. Or anything that has techniques that use vivid imagery and organizational devices. We talked about chunking. I think I mentioned this in the video that was already posted online. 1776, 1492, 1812, 1941 are all important dates. Acronyms, again, Holmes for the different Great Lakes, how to spell arithmetic, things like that. Did talk a little bit about hierarchies, and I've already given you an example of some hierarchies when we were doing learning. I gave you the hierarchy over classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. But there are some ways that we encode information. Did talk a little bit about iconic memory. Remember, that was the simulation you did yesterday in class. Which talked about visual memory. Well, the other type that I don't think we did talk about is echoic memory. That is auditory. I did talk about echoic memory on the previous video. So again, make sure you watch that. So iconic is visual, echoic is auditory. Talked about short-term memory. And, I know you did the thing again, or the simulation yesterday. If you've not, it's posted on Google Classroom. Make sure you do that. But we talked about an experiment where if I gave you a series of consonants and did not let you rehearse, remember, rehearsal is what puts things into long-term memory, which kind of doesn't help us out when we're trying to test short-term memory. If I gave you a series of consonants and didn't let you practice or rehearse, the more time went, the less you would get. So really, at 3 seconds, even afterwards, most people are only getting half right. At 6 seconds, you're only getting 30% right. At 9 seconds, you're getting 20, and you kind of see how that falls off. By 18 seconds, you're getting less than 10% of the list of consonants right. So that's if you don't rehearse. Now, if you do rehearse, that changes all of this up. Okay, so but generally you're limited in time, limited in capacity, with between 5 and 9 things, but generally the number is 7. So this is we talked about long-term memory. We talked about the terms long potentation or long-term potentation. This is an increase in the synapse's firing potential after brief rapid stimulation. So the firing potential goes up after rapid stimulation. We did spend a lot of time talking about how when we have a strong emotion while we're experiencing something and that gets put into memory, those generally make for stronger memories. So the stronger the emotion, the stronger the memories. And how some experiments have shown that certain stress hormones will actually boost learning and retention. So we did talk about that. So we also talked about, what else did we talk about? A couple terms, amnesia. Talked about explicit memory, which is also known as declarative memory, and that's just basically the memory of facts and experiences. These are things you consciously know and consciously can declare and think about. I think I talked about that again in the last video. We also talked about implicit memory, and that's almost also known as procedural memory. These are things that you do without thinking. A lot of times we refer to it as muscle memory. Throwing a softball, you hitting a tennis ball, playing an instrument, walking, things like that are considered implicit and or procedural memory. Make sure you know both, because the AP exam likes to use one or the other. And here's the long-term memory subsystem. Here's the short-term memory subsystem, or at least encoding. You've got with the encoding hierarchy, you've got meaning, which is semantic encoding, imagery, which is visual encoding, and organization, chunks and hierarchies. And then with long-term memory, explicit, again, these are things you can consciously recall, facts, general knowledge, or personally experienced events, semantic memory or episodic memory. And then you've got explicit. Again, these are non-declarative. These are the things you do without consciousness. These are motor skills and cognitive. And also things, this is interesting to make sure you know, is things that you are conditioned to, whether it be classically conditioned or operant conditioned. If you have been conditioned to do something, move when you hear the bell, or go to your next class on the bell, or squint when you get water sprayed in your face, things like that. That is more of a implicit memory. We talked about how the importance of the hippocampus in long-term memory. We didn't spend much time on recall and recognition. I've already talked about that, or relearning. And I did talk about retrieval cues, things like deja vu. And we spent a lot of time talking about mood congruent theory and state-dependent memory, how when we remember things and we are in a certain mood, it is easier to recall those memories when we are in that same mood, whether it be happy or whether it be depressed. And I talked about how that can sort of helps depression feed in on itself, because the memories you make when you're happy, they're not as easily retrieved as the ones you make when you're depressed. And if you keep remembering depressed things, you're likely to stay depressed. Whereas if you have the ability to, or if you can remember things that make you happy, it helps in sort of pulling yourself out. But because of mood congruent memory, it's a lot harder to remember things, happy things, when you are in the depressed mood. And then with state-dependent memory, when you learn things in a specific state, such as high, drunk, or depressed, you can more easily remember those things when you're in the same state. So when you're in college and you're over 21 and you may be studying for an exam and you may drink a little bit while you're studying, it will be more difficult to remember those things unless you are in that same state of consciousness when you take the exam. So I would suggest not drinking at all, and being completely sober when you study, and being completely sober when you take the test. Just saying. Carrie brought up an interesting point. If you chew gum while you study, chew gum when you take the test. Again, that's sort of that state-dependent memory example. So, and that's really where we ended. So today's video, I'm going to spend most of the time on forgetting, and what happens when we do forget things. Remember, for us to remember something, it has to be there will be an event that is sensed by our senses and sent to our sensory memory. Remember, that's very short. Remember, you have to have paid attention to it. If it's something that you don't pay attention to, it's going to be forgot. I mean, it's not going to be encoded. Once you pay attention to it, it's encoded, goes into short-term memory, and then again, once it's in short-term memory, one of two things happens: it either goes to long-term memory, or it's not encoded and it's forgotten after short-term memory. So right now we're going to talk about encoding or forgetting as an encoding failure. Basically, it isn't encoded into long-term memory. Information never gets into long-term memory for whatever reason. It spent some time in short-term memory, and for whatever reason, it was decided it doesn't need to go to long-term, so it's forgotten. All right, after that, 5 to 7 seconds or 30 seconds or whatever it is, it's gone. You don't remember it. And here's an example. You want to talk about things who is not important to be encoded. Which one of these pennies is the correct penny without cheating. Which one is correct? It's that one right there. Right there. All right, now if you want to get it out and look, but this is an example of an encoding failure. Remember we talked about Ebbinghaus earlier. This is another thing he came up with, is the forgetting curve. His experiment, this is an example of that, is the forgetting curve over 30 days. You forget a lot after the 30 days, but then but most of it occurs within the first day or two. And then after 3 days, you've pretty much forgotten everything you're going to forget for the most part. You may forget a little more over the next 27, but for the most part, if you are given a list to learn and then relearn, and then you kind of stop with it for a while, you're going to forget most of that within the first 3 days. And then after that, it kind of levels off. I don't know how many of you are taking Spanish right now. I think we talked about a few of you. This happens quite a bit. Let's say you take your Spanish classes as a freshman and sophomore. Well, by the time you're a senior or maybe a freshman in college, you're going to forget. You're going to go from about 95% retention to about 45% retention. So you're going to forget almost half of it within 3 years. But what you do retain, you actually are going to keep for a while. Okay, you see how that, so forgetting happens quickly, but what is not forgotten stays for a long period of time. Is forgotten much more slowly. Forgetting can result from failure to retrieve information from long-term memory. Maybe it's there, but for whatever reason, it can't be retrieved. You've got a block here. So again, here's the event. Goes into sensory memory. We've paid attention to it. It's encoded in short-term memory, which is then encoded. It's been practiced. Is encoded into long-term memory. Okay, but now it cannot be retrieved. It can't be put back into short-term memory. Remember, in order for us to remember something, it has to go back into short-term memory because that's where our conscious is. If we cannot consciously think about it, then it gets stopped. It can't really be remembered, so it leads to forgetting. There's a lot of different ways that can happen. I think this is kind of what was happening with Dory in Finding Dory. She talked about having short-term memory loss, when in reality, with what we know about memory now, it probably wasn't short-term memory loss. It was probably long-term memory loss. And the issue probably came with retrieval of certain memories. Okay. This can be very confusing, so I want to spend some time on it. Learning some items may disrupt the retrieval of other items. Proactive interference, which is forward-facing. This is a disruptive effect of prior learning on the recall of new information. I think I've talked a little bit about this before. I took French in high school, and I took French the first couple of years of college. I thought my foreign language was out of the way, wouldn't have to worry much about it. Well, the summer before my senior year of college, I took two history or government classes as part of the Kentucky Institute for International Studies. And I think one class was comparative politics. The other one may have been a Mexican history class. I can't remember now. But I went to take those two classes as I needed them for my major. But in order to go, I also had to take a Spanish course. Well, I had already taken French, and there's some similarities between the two, and I did not do very well. And the reason is that I had a lot of proactive interference, forward acting. Basically, my prior learning of French got in the way of me learning the Spanish, and it got in the way of recalling the new information. So I might learn how to say. I might have learned how to say which way to Mexico City in Spanish, but because of my previous learning, it would get in the way. So I would say a bunch of random French and Spanish words, trying to put them together in a sentence, and people would look at me like I had three heads. So that's an example of proactive or forward acting interference. What I learned previous is getting into the way of the new stuff. But this also works the other way, retroactive or backwards acting interference. This is the disruptive effect of new learning on the recall of old information. Phone numbers is a big one on this. Somebody gets a new phone number. Or if people who move a lot, new addresses. I can remember my old address when we lived in Michigan or in Round County, but I no longer remember my address when we lived in Detroit, Michigan. But retroactive is where new information gets in the way of recalling old information. So proactive is old information acting forward on new information. Retroactive interference is new information acting on old information. And this will be on the AP exam. Again, here's an example of that. And again, this was me. French learned beforehand interferes proactively. I studied French and then studied Spanish. I had a hard time with that. Retroactive is if I was say I studied French and then learned Spanish and then had to take a French exam. All right, I would if I had issues, kept saying the Spanish terms instead of the French terms, and that would be retroactive. It was acting on the old information. So, and here are papier and papel, livre and libro, plume and pluma, école and escuela are all French and Spanish terms for the same things. So you can see how that would be an issue. I had a huge issue with this. I can't tell you how frustrating it was. It's the only D I ever got in college. Only thing below a B I ever got in college was these right here. And it drove me nuts. So that's how powerful it can be. Sleep can have an issue with this as well, with retroactive interference. How much sleep you get. I'll let you study this for a minute. This is kind of an interesting chart. If I gave you a bunch of syllables to learn, to recall later, if you went to sleep before I asked you to recall those, you were much more likely to remember those versus if you remained awake the whole time. It's good. You need to know that forgetting can occur at any stage in memory, that as we process information, we filter, alter, or lose a lot of it. So what we retrieve a lot of times is is the most important or the most well, let's see. Look at it like this. All right, here is an event or a something that happened. All right, and let's say it's broken up into a bunch of information bits. All right, let's say you win $1 million, Publishers Clearinghouse or whatever, and all these information bits are pieces of that experience. All right, so that gets put into the sensory memory. You know, you're going to remember the sights, the sounds, the smells, the feelings, the experience, all that stuff are put into bits. Well, as that moves into short-term memory, a few items are both noticed and encoded, so which means sends it into long-term memory. So notice there's some stuff that is not noticed and encoded. For instance, the smell of the dog is not going to be noticed, or it might be noticed, but not be encoded. All right, so there's some parts of this experience that are not encoded into short-term memory, and then part of those are not encoded into long-term memory. Well, when you want to remember that, although there may be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bits of information that's put in long-term memory, you're only going to remember 2 of those. So 2 of those are going to be taken from long-term memory and then brought back to short-term so it can be experienced. So as we process information, we filter, alter, or lose a lot of it. And this is why a lot of times first-hand accounts are not as reliable as we think they are. You know, as a historian going through college, learning to be a historian, one of the things we're always taught is how important primary sources are. You know, people who are there, people who are reliving it. Psychology suggests that maybe those memories are not as accurate as maybe we might think. All right, because let's say we only bring back 2 bits of information out of this whole thing that we experienced. Well, in order for us to for these 2 bits to make sense, a lot of times our brain will sort of make up some of the other parts for the whole thing to make sense. Here's an example. Memory reconstruction. All right, let's say you're in an accident. All right, somebody hits you. As eyewitnesses reconstruct memories, a lot of it depends on how they're questioned. You know, how fast was the car going when they smashed into you versus how fast was the car going when you all hit. All right, the word smashed may influence that memory. Oh, he was going 50 miles an hour. Wham! Versus, well, we were going about 20, maybe 25 when we hit. Hit and smash are 2 entirely different things. And our brains will use that information to replace some of the stuff that was not brought back from long-term memory. So other parts of forgetting or interference, a lot of times we have motivated forgetting. People unknowingly revise memories, or people will go through repression, and this is a big Freudian idea that has kind of stuck around, is that repression is a defense mechanism that banishes from the consciousness anxiety-arousing thoughts, feelings, and memories. People talk about repressed memories or memories they didn't know they had. For whatever reason, the theory is that the mind will push these things out of the consciousness. What more likely is happening is that it is just not being entirely recalled from long-term memory. It's there, but it cannot come back into the short-term memory, which is where the consciousness is, for whatever reason. And a lot of times that could be the motivated forgetting. People unknowingly revise memories. So when we do bring that memory back, again, we filter and fill in information that is missing. Just like right here, 2 bits of information is a lot less than whatever this is, 25. So in order for those 2 bits to make sense, we fill in that information. That is called the misinformation effect, incorporating misleading information into one's memory of an event. You can probably think back to any memory. If I told you to think about a typical, or maybe think about the 4th of July 6 years ago. and go back to that date, and then you start thinking about what you did. Maybe you went to watch fireworks here in Flemingsburg or at Cave Run, or maybe up on the river. As you describe that, your mind is really making a lot of that stuff up as it goes to make what you do remember make sense. So that's the misinformation effect. Source amnesia is attributing to the wrong source an event that we experience, heard about, or read about, or even imagined. You see this a lot with high schoolers. Well, such and such said this. Well, no, they didn't. It was his friend who said that. That's where we attribute the source to something that actually didn't exist. Almost done. And we were talking about misinformation and repression. Memories of abuse. A lot of times that's kind of a question you see asked in courtrooms. Is this actually a repressed memory, or is this something you constructed because of another experience? Child sexual abuse does occur, and some adults do actually forget these episodes. So then the question becomes, well, what triggers these? And then there's a thing called false memory syndrome. And this, we may talk a little bit more about this when we get into psychological problems. But this is a condition which a person's identity and relationships center around a false but strongly believed memory of a traumatic experience. And this happens a lot. A lot of times it's induced by therapists. Are you sure this didn't happen? Well, if somebody essentially creates a false memory of something that did not happen, that is going to affect, a lot of times that affects their personality. I can't believe I allowed this to happen. This is so unlike me. When in reality, it didn't happen. But this person was led to create this false memory. And it happens more often than not. If it didn't happen much, it wouldn't be an issue. But it's called false memory syndrome, and it's something you need to know. Most people can agree on the following things. Injustice happens. Bad things happen to good people. That's not their fault. Things like incest happens. Things like forgetting happens. Recovered memories are commonplace. Memories recovered under hypnosis or drugs are especially unreliable because of the reconstruction that may happen. Memories of things happening before the age of 3 are unreliable. And then memories, whether false or real, can be upsetting. Now, there are some things you can do to boost your memory. Study repeatedly to boost recall. We've talked about this. Repeatedly and over time. Spend more time rehearsing or actively thinking about the material. This is what I want you to do. This is studying. Study more. Make material personally meaningful. Remember, this is the whole semantic memory that we talked about. And then use things like mnemonic devices. Associate with peg words, something that you've already got stored. Make up a story or chunk and create acronyms. You can activate retrieval cues mentally. You can recall events while they're fresh before you encounter misinformation. Get the true, real information encoded. And then test your own knowledge. Rehearse and determine what you don't know yet, and then try and learn those things. So that's it on memory. We will do some stuff with this tomorrow. Hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday. Peace out.